The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining this webinar by the NWT Council on Invasive Species, Pests, and Pathogens. Today, we are super lucky to be joined by a face that will be familiar to some of you. Claire Singer is a PhD candidate in applied sciences at St. Mary's University in Halifax, Nova Scotia. But her research focuses on changes in plant communities here in the NWT, including the spread of non-native plants and changes in berries in the NWT. But Claire is a longtime Northerner, grew up in Yellowknife, and has many years of previous experience working both with the Department of Environment and Natural Resources on species at risk and climate change, as well as on invasive species. So I will pass things over to Claire, and we'll have a question and answer period after the presentation, so everyone can find their chat box in their control panel and pop questions in there as the webinar is going along. So over to you, Claire.
Thanks, Johanna. I think I heard that everybody who's joining is on listen-only mode, so I will rely on Johanna to interrupt and let me know if there's anything wrong with the presentation. Otherwise, I think she has access to the chat, so you can type stuff in there and she'll interrupt me and tell me what to fix as we go. For sure. Okay. So yeah, this is just going to be a bit of a research update on what I've been doing over the last couple of years. I don't have any published results from my research yet, so it's definitely very preliminary at this point in time, but we'll give you a decent idea of at least what I'm working on at this point. So as Johanna said, my overall focus in a very general fashion is changes in plant communities in the Northwest Territories. And within that kind of broad scope, I have kind of three subtopics that I'm working on. So the first is non-native plant surveys in burns, and then the second is non-native plant surveys in rivers or along rivers. And then the third is Indigenous knowledge of berries in the Northwest Territories. So I'll just go through all of those subcomponents individually here as we go through the presentation, plus like a bonus add-on for something that Johanna and I are working on together at the moment. So I guess I just wanted to provide a little bit of context first in terms of like, why am I choosing to study plants in the Northwest Territories? So this figure here, it's not actually part of any of my research. It was just the figure that originally kind of got me interested in changes in species communities in this area. The figure is from the Scenarios Network for Arctic Planning, and it's a little bit dated now, but it still is a nice picture, I find. And this shows climate biomes or cliomes. So it's like the temperature and precipitation averages associated with biomes in the Northwest Territories and the projected shifts over time towards the end of the century. And you can see from the diagram that there are quite a few shifts projected over the next 80 years or so in the Northwest Territories under a high emissions scenario. So anyway, this was kind of like the impetus for my interest in this area, was like what might change in the future, what might the NWT look like in the future. This is my home, so that's why I'm interested in this in the long term. So this is kind of in the context of climate change and changes in species assemblages or communities over time. And then the plant interest is really that like this group of species forms the basis for habitat for so many other species in the Northwest Territories and globally, and they also perform together and in their interactions with other species, this tremendous number of ecosystem services, including carbon storage and nutrient cycling. So this is kind of the basis for my interest in this area. So as we dig into each of these questions, I'll just go through them in order. So we're going to start with non-native plant spread. And I just wanted to provide a little bit of context for this before I get into my research questions and methods. So in this context, we're talking about introduced plant species rather than species that are just kind of like moving up by themselves as part of climate change or as their environments shift naturally. So these are typically species that are introduced by people, either unintentionally or intentionally. So that could be like on the tires of your cars or through gardening or what have you. So that difference between unintentional and intentional introductions. And these species, these introduced plant species, tend to be really heavily associated with areas of human disturbance. So you're likely to find them in and around communities and along roadsides in particular. But the interest that I have is that, so these species are very well adapted to these kind of disturbed areas, and they move with people often. But there is some evidence that's suggesting in other areas that they will also move then into natural areas via natural disturbances. So for instance, forest fire burns or along river corridors. Both of those represent forces of natural disturbance. Fires, very obviously, through the removal of trees or changes to the vegetation in that area, and then rivers through that kind of regular action of the water, either through currents or spring freshet, for example, stripping the banks. So that's kind of where, if we expected to see these plants move into natural areas, which is what I'm interested in for this question, we would expect to see them move first through these areas of natural disturbances. So this is kind of where the focus is for me. And we have to keep in mind that how plants establish and whether they spread and where they spread and the impact that they have is really context specific. So this, what happens in one area is sometimes quite difficult to extrapolate to another area. So this is kind of why I wanted to do this work in the Northwest Territories specifically, to kind of get that context specificity. So the research questions for burns in this particular case, I wanted to know whether the plants that had been introduced along roadsides in the Northwest Territories were spreading, and are they spreading into burns? So does the spread differ by a burned habitat versus an unburned habitat, essentially, or a burned site versus an unburned site? And then does it differ by habitat type? So different areas of the Northwest Territories, are we seeing different kinds of spread in those areas? And then does it differ by stand type? So if you have coniferous forest, does spread differ in there compared to a deciduous forest or a meadow, for example? And then in the rivers, this was a bit more general, and I was just looking at what kind of downstream spread is occurring. When I worked for ENR, we had heard kind of anecdotal reports of spread of non-native plants or introduced plants down rivers in the Northwest Territories, but we don't really have that documented anywhere. So this was kind of the first stage that we undertook this year, was to understand what kind of spread there was on the major rivers in the Northwest Territories. And then if that was occurring, what kind of patch size we were looking at. So how big were the areas that had established non-native plants in them. And then the other objective for this year was to select study sites for further study next year. So I'll get into that in a little bit more detail in a second here. So the team members that I had for this year, in addition to myself, were Aisling Dunn, who's a Yellowknife-based university student, and she came and did the burn surveys with me, and then I partnered with Johanna Stewart and Shakita Jensen with ENR, and they actually conducted the river surveys for me entirely this year. I was supposed to start research last summer, and everything was delayed by the pandemic. So I was trying to make up a bit of time this year, and Johanna and Shakita were lifesavers in getting that accomplished this year. So for the burn surveys, we conducted those in July 1st, or between July 1st and August 7th this summer. We used random transect selections. So we overlaid the roads with the burns, the burn mapping, which I got from Forest Management Division with ENR, and overlaid that again with the habitat type. And we were using, for habitat type, we were using level 4 ecoregions as a proxy for habitat type. So the level 4 ecoregions are kind of just divisions within the Northwest Territories based on climate and vegetation. So that's why we were using them as a proxy for habitat. And we used 4 different ecoregions in the study area. And then each of those transects that we were using were buffered for edge effects. So it means that the transect was always 250 meters away from each other at minimum, usually much further than that, and then 250 meters at least from the edge of the burn, for example. This is the kind of a general map of the study area, and these are the burns. So everything in orange here is one of the burns, and you can see the date of the burn that's on there. So the transects that we were running were mostly within these burns, plus we then did additional site transects for comparison outside of the burns, kind of like in this area or kind of in here, for example. So yeah, we did this in 4 parts. The first part was Highway 1 between Fort Providence and Fort Simpson, and then Highway 3 between Yellowknife and Fort Providence, Highway 4 on the Ingram Trail, and then Highway 5 between Hay River and Fort Smith. And you can kind of see that that's where the roadside adjacent burns were. So this is how we set up the transects this summer. I'm not sure if you guys can see my mouse, but maybe you can.
Yes, we can.
Options. You can, okay, perfect. Okay, so the transects all ran perpendicular to the edge of the road, and the aim was to kind of assess the limit of spread from the road. So we have the road here, the slope of the road, which is kind of the gravel bank on the side of the road from during construction. And then from here all the way to the edge of where the trees were or are, depending on the transect, is what we would call the verge. And we had 2 plots in each of those verges. And then this one here where the trees are, so the trees would kind of be along this line, or the remnants of the trees if it was a burn would be along this line, and then the edge plot was put right behind that. And then every other plot from there is at these set distances, and that was where we were kind of assessing the limit of spread through these set distances of plots along this set transect. So this is kind of what it looked like in person. This is a burn transect. So the road is kind of down here, and we're looking into the burn. So we would have 2 plots right in here, one kind of right behind those snags there, and then everything, all the other plots would go further back into the burn there. And then the same thing here, but this is an unburned transect. So the road is right here, and then we would run into here with 2 verge plots and an edge right behind those trees, and then further into the forest to assess whether there was any spread in there. And then each of those plots is 1 square meter. And we did a complete vegetation inventory within each of those 1 square meter plots. And you can kind of see what that looks like right here. So we would be, getting down on our hands and knees and trying to identify absolutely everything that is growing in that plot, vegetation-wise at least. So ultimately we did 8 burned transects per ecoregion and 8 unburned transects per ecoregion for a total of 64 transects. And then we did 259 1 square meter plots over the summer. So as I said, I don't have results written up for this yet. We're still working through the analysis at this point in time, and I'm working through a very large stack of voucher specimens here to verify the species IDs and whatnot before I finalize the analysis. But essentially, we saw pretty limited spread within the burns in the Southwest Northwest Territories. And that was despite sometimes quite substantial roadside presence. So I guess that's good news. Where we did see spread occurring, like in this area here behind me, this is all white sweet clover behind me, in a burn near Samba Day Territorial Park. We were seeing it in areas where the regrowth was deciduous or mixed. So we'll dig into that more through the analysis, because I can't tell you at this point whether or not those results are significant or not, but that, anecdotally, that's what we were seeing when we were out in the field. So then the river surveys, it's still that focus on introduced or non-native plants, but here we wanted to see how much spread there was along the riverbanks. And we were using the communities kind of as the assumed point of introduction for these plants. So all of our surveys were downstream of a river. And those took place between July 25th and August 5th this summer. And they, as I said before, they were conducted by Johanna and Shakita, which is fantastic. I really appreciate their help this summer. These were day trip surveys. So basically they went as far down the river as they could within a day trip. And these are visual surveys. So they sometimes got out of the boat and sometimes they didn't. But essentially in this case, we were using target species instead of this big vegetation inventory. And we selected these 6 target species because they're kind of the more common ones that you would see along in the Northwest Territories in terms of introduced plants. But they're also quite easily seen or visible species. So the scentless chamomile, the narrowleaf hawksbeard, the 2 sweet clovers, so the white and the yellow sweet clover, the field sow thistle, which is super tall, and the red clover. So they were trying to boat as close to the shore as they could so they can get a visual on these, and then if they could, they got out of the boat and they mapped the kind of the limit of spread was the original methodology there, and then got coordinates for each of those patches. And we partnered with community folks in Fort Smith and Fort Providence and Fort Simpson, who were super helpful and made sure that our team got down the river safely, which was fantastic. So again, I don't have a different map, so I'm just going to use the same map again. But we did 3 surveys this summer, or 4 surveys actually this summer along rivers. So 2 points at the Mackenzie River, 1 downstream, like starting at Fort Providence and then moving downstream, and 1 at Fort Simpson and moving downstream. And then the Slave River starting at Fort Smith, and the Yellowknife River starting at Yellowknife, or actually at the Yellowknife Bridge. And then next year we didn't quite finish them. The flowering season was starting to run out on us there, so we're hoping next year to get back out and do the Liard River at Fort Liard and the Hay River at Hay River to kind of complete those results for the major rivers in the study area. So in contrast to the burns, we observed pretty substantial spread down the rivers. So basically the entire distance that could be covered within a day had spread down it. We did not find the limit of spread downstream. And it was mostly white and yellow sweet clover with a few others, of course. But you can kind of see what that looks like behind this photo of Chiquita here. And this is along the banks of the Slave River. So this is all white sweet clover back here. So pretty substantial patches. And actually, like in our debrief afterwards, what I was hearing from Johanna and Chiquita was that that measuring the spread of the patch, or like the size of the patch, was functionally impossible in some areas. Like it was just the entire bank of the river that was covered in them. So so we got coordinates for that, but not so much patch size, because it's basically the whole bank of the river in places. And then yeah, that's essentially where we're at in terms of the non-native plant spread study. And I'll be continuing to do the analysis over this winter and hopefully getting some results published at some point in time, although this river survey, as I mentioned before, is continuing. So we'll hopefully get back out next summer and finish that one up next year. This is just like a bonus here. This is some work that I was doing with Johanna for the NWT Council on Invasive Species, Pests and Pathogens. I think, did I get that acronym right, Johanna?
You did, good job.
So we wrote a draft field guide to non-native plants in the Northwest Territories. It's not comprehensive, so there's about 140 documented non-native or introduced plants in the Northwest Territories, and this guide is limited to kind of the top 25 to 30 that you would see if you were out driving for the most part in the NWT, in the Southwest NWT in particular. But this is kind of, these are the ones you're most likely to see, and we're kind of hoping that it will be helpful for folks to identify what they're seeing and their origins. So this is what it would, obviously it's still being reviewed right now, but this is kind of the content that we're aiming for. It will end up looking different, I'm sure. But yeah, there will be some identification characteristics in there, some discussion of its habitat and biology, anything that it might get confused with on the ground, we've tried to articulate in here to help you out when you're out in the field, and then just like some interesting facts about it. So I'm not sure exactly what the timeline is on that one, but perhaps Johanna can speak to that, that stuff that's happening behind the scenes.
Yeah, so we're in the process of reviews right now. We've got a few of our expert botany people taking a look, and once that's done, we'll go to layout and stuff and hopefully have it ready for kind of the spring summer season so that people can be using this resource.
Great, thanks, Johanna.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so then just moving on to this this last portion of my research, Indigenous knowledge of berries in the Northwest Territories. This is a picture from trying to go berry picking this fall, very unsuccessfully. We went with my friend's toddlers and they were not okay with how slow we were going. So it was not a very successful berry picking expedition. Essentially, I just want to kind of go over some background for this, because this is a large partnership project. It's definitely not just me that's involved with it and not just me that's leading it. But to provide some background, this project started, or the impetus for this project came about in 2017 when the NWT Species at Risk Committee assessed grizzly bears. And during that assessment, there was reports that were included in our literature review about declines in some berry species, like in the crops. So the the size of for the yield of the berries on per plant, the size of the berries, so people were feeling like they were smaller, and the condition of the berries, people were feeling like they were kind of like mealy and dry. So yeah, declines in condition, size, and yield in berry plants in a couple different areas of the Northwest Territories were reported during this assessment of grizzly bears. And that kind of led to a discussion about whether berries should be looked at in any kind of detail to see what was going on there. So the Species at Risk Committee ultimately, after some discussion, decided or recommended rather that berries, kind of as a suite of species, they had so much ecological, economic, and cultural importance in the Northwest Territories that it merited consideration, these reports that we were getting of declines in various areas, like very, very separate areas of the Northwest Territories. It definitely wasn't like a localized kind of thing. And then in addition to that, like the broader context that fits within is that these kinds of reports are being seen across the circumpolar north. So it's not unique to the Northwest Territories. We've seen similar reports of declines in the berries in Alaska and the Yukon and Nunavik, as well as in like Finland, for example. So even over across the ocean on the other part of the circumpolar north. So it seems to be part of a bit of a broader trend that is being reported in this area. So that kind of added to this idea of importance behind looking into how the berries were doing in the Northwest Territories. So the ultimate recommendation from that discussion was that an Indigenous knowledge study should be conducted to look at like what we do know about berries in the NWT, what we don't know, so like gaps in our knowledge, changes that are being seen in berries or berry plants, or berry habitat, potential causes of those changes. And there was quite a bit of discussion about this. The reports that we've seen from within the Northwest Territories are from Indigenous knowledge holders. So it was, in addition to that source material, the idea that the breadth and scale of Indigenous knowledge was probably more suited to this type of research question than more kind of local specific scientific studies. So that's kind of why we've chosen to pursue this study from an Indigenous knowledge focus rather than a science focus at this point in time. So the scale of this project is quite large, it's the whole territory. We're hoping to conduct work in all regions of the Northwest Territories, and it's not limited to any particular species of berries. So here we've got lingonberries, or cranberries pictured here, but it's definitely not limited to just that species. The two species that we did get reports of declines about were the lingonberries as well as blueberries, but the study is open to all sorts of berries. So anything that people are using or harvesting or interact with is what they can talk about during the study. So any berry, so in addition to these, you might think of like cloudberries or soapberries or what have you. So quite a broad scope to this study. The methods that we're using are standardized semi-structured interview questions. So it means that we've got a set of predetermined questions with prompts underneath them so that we can help guide those conversations a little bit. But that kind of that choice there reflects the number of people that are involved in this project to make sure that we have consistent results across regions. But then to accompany that, we're pursuing flexible methods on the ground. So sometimes we might be using one-on-one interviews, but in other areas we might use focus groups or mapping sessions, essentially what is deemed to be most appropriate for that area in consultation with the communities and the renewable resources boards, for example. And then that will all be articulated through data sharing and research agreements. Our aim in doing this here is to understand how berries are doing in the Northwest Territories and what might be affecting them, but we want the data to be but we won't have ownership over the data at the end. So the data will be going back to communities for long-term storage and ownership there. So that will all be articulated in those agreements to make sure that that's clear and everybody's on the same page before we get started. So the partners to date, this is still being developed. It's a big project, so conversations are ongoing, but to date our partners are as follows. So the NWT Conference of Management Authorities, and this is in alphabetical order, not in the order that we talk to people in or what have you. So the NWT Conference of Management Authorities, which includes all the co-management authorities for species at risk in the Northwest Territories, the Government of the Northwest Territories, Gwich'in Tribal Council, Gwich'in Renewable Resources Board, North Slave Métis Alliance Satu Renewable Resources Board, the NWT Species at Risk Committee, who initiated this project, Cleacho Government, and the Wikizii Renewable Resources Board. And as I said, we are working on partnerships with other organizations as well at this time. So for progress, we haven't actually started research for this one. So this is very preliminary kind of overview of this research project. We just got our license approved and we just got our ethics clearance. So because we're going to be talking with people, we have to go through this additional level of ethical clearance for our research license, which takes a little while, but that has happened now and we're really pleased with that. We've secured a good chunk of our funding through ArcticNet and the GNWT, so thank you so much to those funders for supporting this project. And at the moment, we're working on scheduling over the next couple of years to get this work done. And this is our advisory committee here in the photo. They have christened themselves the Buried Happy Pickers. It's very punny. We're very happy with that. But I'll just introduce you to them. So Michelle Grabke here, Elaine Lamalis, Madison Menaco Melnick in the hat here, who was doing some work for Aurora College for her degree there. Lila Erasmus, myself, and Denize Nakiko, who's been doing an amazing job facilitating all of our meetings and making sure that we all stay on track. And then we've got Anne Thrasher and Margaret Leishman, Margaret McDonald, Celine Proctor, Alistine Andre, and Annie Buckle, also known as Cranberry Annie. So yeah, we're very grateful for everybody's advice and help on this project. We're really excited to be getting this one off the ground finally. It was a long slog trying to get it going through the pandemic, so we're really pleased that we can get it moving now. And that's it. Pretty short and sweet presentation. Are there any questions that anybody has? I see no questions. Do you see any, Johanna? Oh, I can't hear you.
Okay, I was muted and somebody used the question and answer box to tell me that, so I know that it's working. Okay, what I was trying to say is that was a great presentation and super exciting to see that work on the cranberry group getting started. That has been a long time getting going. So yeah, people are welcome to drop any questions in the question and answer box or the chat. I don't see any yet, but I have a question just to get things started, Claire. Because you showed us one of your roadside plots, which just looked like very difficult to identify everything in the field, I imagine. And if you could talk a little bit about if you couldn't identify something in the field, what were the steps that you take at that point?
Yeah, so we were generally pretty familiar with the non-native plants that we were looking for finding that limit of spread. But we were trying to do an inventory within each of those plots so that later on we could assess dominance within the plots or changes over time in the future, at least set it up for that in the future. So if we were, yeah, there was a lot of plants in a lot of those plots, and some of them were really hard to identify. So if we couldn't identify a plant that was in the field, we took photos of that plant, and we typically took a voucher, at least the first time that we saw it, which means we dug it up and we brought it home with us. And that is what I mean when I say I'm still working through this stack of voucher specimens here. Yeah, so that will be how I verify the species IDs on this, to be able to go a little bit more slowly than we're going in the field, especially for some of these groups of plants that can be quite difficult to distinguish in the field, like the asters or some of the grasses. Yeah, that's essentially how we dealt with that situation.
Cool. Okay, we do have a question in the chat. Someone has asked, do you have any guesses why invasive species appear to be spreading faster along rivers than roads? Are boats carrying seeds, or are they spreading by natural means like floating?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So we're not really sure what the vectors are in rivers. What you've said are reasonable kind of assumptions or guesses about what the vectors are, like boats or in the water. I would guess that there's more spread along the rivers because I guess I'll just back up here. And Johanna, please correct me if you think I'm misinterpreting what you told me before, but what we were seeing was spread along the rivers, but not necessarily away from the rivers. So it was kind of lateral spread, or like spread along, but not perpendicular from the river. And my assumption would be that that is very much related to competition with other plants. So if you have a highly diverse area, for example, in some areas, you might see not a lot of space for another plant to establish, for example. So yeah, I guess we might want to then think about like, well, we have quite substantial spread along roadsides in the Northwest Territories, but we're not seeing a lot of lateral spread, like into the forests from there. And that's kind of analogous to what we were seeing in the rivers. We just hadn't looked at the rivers before in a lot of detail. So we were seeing a lot of spread along the rivers, but not a lot of spread away from the rivers.
Right.
So yeah, definitely kind of analogous trends. We just hadn't looked at the rivers before.
Okay, another question here. Are there alien or native plant species that were unexpected in your surveys this past summer?
Not really. We saw we saw a lot of common species that we were expecting to see. So a lot of bearberry, for example, in terms of native species in those areas. Lots of grasses. Yeah, the non-native plants that we were seeing were generally pretty expected. We kind of always like Michael Oldham had done some work in 2016 on roadside surveys for non-native plants. So we had a decent idea of which species were there and kind of their relative abundance next to each other. So yeah, no really big surprises there. I guess not related to my study at all, but just out of personal interest, I was really surprised by how much mountain death chemists we came across. That was just a fun kind of anecdote for us to come across it. Like in almost every single one of our transects, we were finding that one. And the number of ants nests, every single transect. They were crawling up our legs all the time. So that was a little bit surprising, but the plant communities were nothing that we weren't really expecting.
Yeah, I guess from my perspective, the one interesting thing that I heard from you, Claire, since I was seeing basically only sweet clover, and yet you, at least in one location, were noticing spread of sow thistle, which I personally hadn't seen before.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess that's a really good point, Johanna. Thanks for bringing that up. We did see some substantial patches of the sweet clovers, but also sometimes, well, actually, like the distance spread that we did observe was never the sweet clover. It was the sow thistle or the dandelions. So yeah, maybe not expecting that quite. Yeah.
All right, another question is, for the roadside plots, are you collecting full species richness and abundance for both vascular and non-vascular plants in addition to non-native?
Vascular plants only. So we weren't looking at lichens or mosses or anything like that. But yes, we were looking at native and non-native. But we were not like counting stems in terms of abundance. We were using Braun-Bonnke cover classes. So those kind of are grouped into 1 to 5%, 5 to 25%, 25 to 50, 50 to 75, 75 to 100%. So they're more like these categories of abundance within the plot, and that's what we'll use for assessing dominance later on. And we want to get an idea of what the relative abundance of native versus non-native plants in those plots are.
Cool. They followed up with perfect, thank you. So.
Okay. Yeah, I can't see the chat. I was thinking I have a chat button, but I can't see anything in it, so no idea what's going on.
I'll keep reading them to you, don't worry.
Thank you.
So the next question, in communities that conduct prescribed burning to remove surface fuel within town, there seems to be an increase in invasive species throughout the summer. Does fire facilitate invasive species?
There are some mixed reports in the literature about this. Generally, the types of introduced plants that we see around communities are plants that are like what we would call rudderall plants, but if you think about in your garden, they're the plants that need a lot of light. They're like the full sun plants, and they're really good at dealing with disturbance. So that tends to be why those ones established, because you get disturbance of any kind, and suddenly there's a ton more light hitting the ground. There's a lot less competition from other plants in that area. Yeah, and it might change the soil, for example, in some areas as well. And generally, these plants tend to deal pretty well with the soil being dug up regularly, which is why, like, every time I dig the chickweed out of my garden, it just comes back stronger. Yeah, so like the question in fires is related to succession, really. Is so maybe they establish for a short period of time after the burn because there is a lot more light in that area, and they don't have a lot of competition then, so they're able to establish in that area. But the question then is whether, like in a long-term study, would they stay or would they get outcompeted by other species as the forest regrows, for example. So it's yeah, the answer is it depends, I guess. That's probably not very helpful.
Okay, another question. Oh, it's a question for me. It says, you didn't find the downstream limits of spread during your river surveys. Did any of the community boat drivers or other participants share their knowledge of how far downstream invasive plants might have spread? So yeah, I don't have, we weren't able to really quantify that, like give it a distance since we weren't able to reach the limit of spread, but just like as an example, the Slave River, where we did our first river survey, because it was the first day, we actually didn't get too far. We were still working out the kinks in the methodology and stuff. But the boat drivers very quickly were, once we showed them what species we were looking for, they recognized it and could tell us that it was spread basically down the whole river as far as they had gone. So probably pretty substantial spread.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, we wouldn't know without doing, I think, much longer than a day trip.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard from other folks that that those, especially the clover and some others, they've observed all the way down to the delta. So good good distance, yeah.
On some
We're
of
not
the
sure
rivers,
what's going on in the middle.
Yeah, on some of the rivers we were boating as far as like 20 kilometers downstream from town, and we're still finding the sweet clover or other invasive species there. And then a clarifying question, I assume downstream is relative to boat launch sites. Oh, what about upstream? Yeah, what about spread upstream of communities?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It really does depend on how you define downstream. Technically, for some of those southern rivers, everything is downstream relative to another point. We didn't look at downstream with these survey methods because we were assuming that the community was the site that the seeds were being introduced from. But that's a good question to go back to potentially in the future if we want to isolate the vectors for movement. So like how the plants are moving. And I think, Johanna, did you mention that Parks Canada was maybe doing a similar survey in Nahanni National Park Reserve, and they did see spread upstream?
That
maybe
is my understanding, is that they're doing sort of similar, looking at invasive species in the parks. And that would be upstream of the community, I believe. Okay, I don't see any more questions. I'll give people another minute or two if you've got any last questions for Claire.
I might also add that, like, I think very early on in the presentation, I said that part of the objectives for this year was to select sites for next year. And that's because we want to do impact studies next year, and we can't do them until we know where they are growing. So we were trying to figure out where they were growing mostly this year. And then we'll use this information that we gained this year to try and find some sites that might be useful for doing an impact study. There's been some studies in other areas, like in Alaska, for example, on the white sweet clover in riparian areas, so along riverbanks, that suggests that there can be adverse impacts to native species, native plant species, like outcompeting other plants. And then there's other studies that suggest that the presence of the white clover improves pollination rates to native plants. So yeah, it can be good and bad for sure. We're not trying to vilify any of these plants. We're just kind of interested in seeing what's happening and understanding what's happening.
Yeah, and we've got some clarification from someone from Parks who's in the chat.
Oh, perfect.
So to clarify for Nahanni, we are doing surveys but not currently focused on the rivers. We did see some downstream spread from key visitor access areas. So again, yeah, looking like those introduction points are where we're seeing spread downstream. And another question here, do invasive species affect the overall chemistry of the area, like the pH of the soil?
Right. Depends on the species as to what kind of effect that they can have on the soil. So in this context, often the plants that are in the pea family, like the sweet clovers, for example, are more of concern because they can fix nitrogen, which can change the nutrient levels in the soil. There's other plants that can engage in something called allelopathy, which is essentially like below ground chemical warfare on other plants. Yeah, so they can change, I'm not sure about pH specifically, but they can definitely change chemistry and nutrient levels in the soil. We're not sure how much of that is happening at this point in time.
Great. I'm not seeing any more questions in the chat. So I think we can wrap it up here. Thank you so much, Claire, for this presentation, and hopefully we can follow up with you maybe again once you've got some more defined results and
yeah, for sure,
see what happened.
Hopefully before the next field season, I'll have everything written up and ready to go.
Awesome.
Yeah. And if anybody wants to reach out, my contact information is on the screen there. If you want to talk about the berry project, we have a specific berry email address, which is also there.
Great. Yeah, and from the council's side, we'll be sharing, any updates or other outreach that we'll be putting on through our website. That's nwtkisp.ca, nwtcispp.ca, or on our Facebook page, which is just NWT Council on Invasive Species, Pests, and Pathogens. So hopefully, yeah, we'll connect again, Claire, and we'll be able to put on more cool events like this, and maybe even get out in the field over the summer.
For sure.
Cool. Well, thank you everyone for joining us online, and thank you again, Claire, for a great presentation.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for everybody for joining. Bye.